You know, when we think of the 1920s, we get this instant picture, right? Flappers, jazz clubs, the stock market going through the roof. We call it the Roaring Twenties for a reason. It feels like one big, decade-long party. But what if that entire image was basically a mirage? What if just beneath that glittering surface, a global catastrophe was already brewing? Okay, let's really get into this era of illusions.
So this is the big question we're going to tackle. Was all that prosperity in the 20s built on something solid, or was it just a house of cards, teetering on the edge of collapse right from the start? Turns out the answer is hiding in a series of really deep structural problems that, well, almost everybody at the time just chose to ignore.
The first huge illusion was all about the economy. See, after the absolute devastation of World War I, the world's leaders were, well, they were nostalgic for the good old days. They tried to basically glue the old pre-war global economy back together. The problem was, the world had fundamentally changed. The old rules, they just didn't apply anymore.
Now, this is a really key point. The problem wasn't that the world couldn't make stuff anymore. The factories and farms could still produce plenty of goods. The real issue was that the entire international system, the network of trade, investment, and lending that actually moves all that stuff around the globe, was completely and totally shattered.
And this slide just lays it out perfectly. Before the war, you had these vast empires, like Austria-Hungary, that were basically single, giant economic zones. After the war, they got carved up into a ton of smaller countries. Europe went from 20 economic units to 27. And all these new borders just became roadblocks, clogged up with new taxes and rules, strangling all the old trade routes.
So, while Europe was breaking apart, a new economic superpower was taking center stage. The United States came out of the war stronger than it had ever been. It went from being a nation that owed money to being the world's main lender and its #1 exporter. Suddenly, all financial roads led directly to Wall Street.
And right here, this is where the whole illusion starts to completely unravel. The brand new leader of the global economy, the world's biggest creditor, essentially put up a giant keep out sign on its front door. At the exact moment other countries needed to sell their goods to the US to earn dollars to pay back their debts, America did the exact opposite.
So you end up with this totally self-defeating contradiction. On one hand, American policy was all about aggressively pushing its own products on the rest of the world. But on the other hand, it was blocking anyone else's products from coming in with these massive tariffs. It's like insisting that everyone has to buy from your store, but then refusing to accept their money. This created a huge dollar shortage around the world and made the entire global financial system incredibly unstable.
And if that commercial contradiction wasn't bad enough, on top of it was a literal mountain of political debt. The war left behind this tangled, messy web of what governments owed each other, creating a system so fragile that just one little push could bring the whole thing crashing down.
And the numbers, they were just staggering. The U.S. had loaned its allies around $10 billion. I mean, that's an absolutely colossal sum. And Washington expected every single penny back, plus interest. They didn't see it as a contribution to a shared war effort. They saw it as a business deal, plain and simple.
This famous quote from President Coolidge just perfectly captures that American attitude. It's so blunt. There was zero room for discussion about shared sacrifice or anything like that. To the Americans, it was simple, a loan is a loan. But to the European allies, who had lost millions of people, well, it felt like a profound betrayal.
And at the very bottom of this pyramid of debt was Germany, just crushed by the war reparations the Allies were demanding. To try and pay, the German government just started printing money, and then more money, and then more money, until their currency became completely, utterly worthless. It led to one of the most terrifying economic collapses you can possibly imagine.
I mean, just look at this image. It says more than any statistic ever could. When your entire life savings become cheaper than firewood, society itself just begins to break down. This is what hyperinflation looks like on a human level. It's the complete destruction of value, of trust, of everything.
So how did they fix this crisis? Well, with another illusion. They came up with something called the Dawes Plan in 1924, which created this absurdly circular flow of cash. Okay, follow me on this. It starts with American banks lending money to Germany. Then, Germany uses that exact same money to pay reparations to France and the UK. And then, France and the UK use that exact same money to pay their war debts back to, you guessed it, the United States.
So let's be really clear here. The Dawes Plan didn't actually fix anything. It just papered over all the cracks. It replaced a system of forced payments with a system of voluntary American loans. The whole thing kind of worked, but, and this is a huge but,
only as long as Wall Street kept the money spigot turned on. Europe's entire stability was now hanging by a thread, and that thread was the American stock market. Okay, so the money was a mess, but the illusions weren't just economic. After the absolute horror of the Great War, the world put all its faith in a new political idea, an international group that could prevent war forever. This was the world's great hope for a lasting sense of security.
And here it is, the League of Nations in Geneva. This was supposed to be the Parliament of Man, right? A place where countries would settle their arguments with words, not with weapons. It was a revolutionary concept, and it embodied the world's desperate desire for peace.
But the promise was completely hollow. The League was basically crippled from the day it was born. For one, its biggest champion, the United States, refused to even join its own creation. Then, any real action required a unanimous vote, which, as you can imagine, was nearly impossible to get. And most importantly, it had no army. It could pass all the resolutions it wanted, but it had zero power to actually enforce them. The illusion of collective security was just that, an illusion.
So let's just recap where we are. We've got a global economy built on a massive contradiction, financed by a ridiculous circular flow of debt, and supposedly policed by a totally powerless institution. Even at the height of the Roaring '20s, the whole system was just rotting from the inside out. All it needed was one final push.
Now here's something that most people don't realize. The collapse didn't start on Wall Street. It started out in the farmlands. While cities like New York and London were booming, the world's farmers in Eastern Europe and Latin America, all over Asia, were already in a deep depression. The prosperity of the '20s was dangerously uneven.
And this explains exactly how it happened. During the war, European farms were destroyed, so global food prices skyrocketed. Farmers everywhere else rushed to plant more to meet the demand. But then, in the mid-20s, European agriculture not only recovered, it got way more efficient. And suddenly, bam, there was a massive global surplus of food. Prices completely crashed, bankrupting farmers and even entire countries that relied on agriculture.
This agricultural crisis was really the first major crack in the facade. A huge chunk of the world's population could no longer afford to buy industrial goods. The entire shimmering palace of 1920s prosperity, the debts, the trade, the consumer boom, it was all balanced on one single thing, the seemingly unstoppable engine of American finance. And in 1929, that engine sputtered and died.
And you know, the whole story of the 1920s really leaves us with this one critical question, one that's just as relevant today as it was 100 years ago. When things are going great, when the economy is booming and the future looks incredibly bright, do we ever actually stop and ask what it's all built on? Or do we just get swept up in the illusion, only to be shocked when it all comes crashing down?